I caught my husband lying about another late meeting. And the truth did not whisper, it screamed. When I cleaned his car, my hand slid under the seat and closed around a small tube that did not belong to our life. I said nothing. I stirred caramel at the bakery, wiped flour from my ring, and made one switch only truth would understand. By afternoon our street shook with sirens. Red trucks, neighbors watching, and my son in uniform stepped off the engine. In that chaos I stood in Sister Bernice's doorway and watched the life I built tilt. I was not there to shout. I was there to witness. The door opened, voices stumbled, shame flooded the room, and in one breath the secret my husband hid showed its face to everyone. 43 years of vows met a blaze of clarity, and the woman I used to be fell quiet so the woman I must become could speak. If you are here with me, like and subscribe and tell me your city because tonight the truth walked in. I caught my husband lying about another late meeting, and the truth did not whisper. It knocked on my window like a hard rain and would not stop. My name is Lorraine May Henderson, 66 years old, born and raised on the West Side and now the owner of Sweet Lorraine's on Auburn Avenue, where cinnamon and vanilla open the morning before the sun finds the church steeple. I am the kind of woman who keeps lists on the fridge and flour on my sleeves, who turns the deadbolt twice and sets the kettle just so, who knows the sound of our old wall clock the way a mother knows the breath of her child. That clock ticked with a steady patience while I sat at the kitchen table waiting for Julian, my husband of 43 years, a good-looking man with an expensive cologne and a wallet full of dinner receipts he never let me file. The house held its breath. The light over the sink hummed. I folded a dish towel into a perfect square and listened to the street where crickets played the same old song. He came in near midnight with his tie loose and his voice careful. He kissed my cheek like a polite visitor and said there had been a difficult client and a second round of drinks, and he would talk about it in the morning when his head cleared. I nodded because I have learned that sometimes a nod is a better witness than a question. He moved through our rooms with a kind of performance, jacket to the sofa, shoes left by the door, cologne in the air, and under it was something new, a sweet floral trace I did not own and could not place in our cabinets. I am not quick to anger. I am a woman of the long simmer. So I wiped the counter and stacked plates for the bakery, and let that scent sit beside me like an uninvited guest. When he slept, the snore low and steady, I stood by the bedroom doorway and watched the man who once carried sacks of flour for me when we had nothing but one mixer and a prayer. Memory is a soft thief. It will show you a first dance and hide the broken step. I went to the small den and opened the ledger book where I keep my orders, but the numbers blurred, and the pages smelled faintly of almond from the extract I spilled that afternoon, and I thought about vows and mornings and all the Sundays we sat in the same pew without holding hands. In the early light I walked to the bakery while the city yawned awake. I set the ovens, cracked eggs, and stirred sugar until it fell like warm rain through my fingers. Men and women who have known heartbreak still bake bread. We learn how to fold pain into dough until it rises into something that can feed a house. I pressed my ring against the cool steel of the table and asked the Lord for patience. I boxed pastries for the Grand Hotel, signed the invoice, smiled at the driver, and thought about the scent again, that floral note that did not belong to me. When I came home, sunlight sat on the kitchen floor like gold paper. Julian had already left with a mug half full, and a note that said busy day, love you. My eyes did not skip over the love. I pressed it with my thumb and felt nothing. I cleaned his car that afternoon because cleaning is prayer when your heart is loud. I collected coins from the ashtray, a grocery receipt with barbecue sauce on the corner, a pair of sunglasses he never wears because they make his ears hurt, and then my hand slid beneath the passenger seat and closed around a small tube that did not belong to our life. I held it only a second. I did not gasp. I did not scold the wind. I set it back where I found it. Then I stood in the driveway and listened to a child ride a bicycle down the block, the chain popping like popcorn, a small sound that made me remember our son Darius at 8 years old, knees bruised, eyes bright, promising he would be careful while he learned how to turn without falling. He is 42 now and he wears a uniform and leads a team that runs toward smoke when others run away. A mother never stops counting breaths. The wall clock took me through the rest of the day. Tick while I brushed crumbs from the counter. Tick while I called Sister Bernice to ask if she needed anything from the store. Tick while I watched the street from the front window and saw neighbors walking dogs and carrying groceries, ordinary people with ordinary problems, and I stood there with an ache that did not feel ordinary at all. At supper the house was quiet except for the clink of forks. Julian talked about numbers and clients, words that should have sounded like responsibility but landed like smoke. I listened and thought about the little ways a life tells on itself. How a man who hates long drives will suddenly love a city 2 hours away. How a phone that used to buzz on the table now stays face down in his pocket. How the mirror tells you the truth even when you want a story. After dishes I went to the den and opened a photo album. There we were on our 10th anniversary, me in a blue dress with tiny pearls at the collar. Him with a bottle of Cabernet we could not afford but bought anyway. He had his hand at the small of my back. A touch you remember when the world is shifting under your feet. I traced the edge of the picture until my finger warmed it. Then I closed the book and I prayed. Not the loud kind. The kind where you sit still until your bones stop arguing. Later I walked out to the porch with a cup of peppermint tea. Sister Bernice waved from across the way and came over slow, the way elders do when the day has been long. We did not speak first about men or money. We spoke about peaches at the market, and how the summer heat makes the air cling to a woman like a shawl. Then she looked at me with those eyes that see through Sunday clothes and asked if I was all right. I told her I felt like a window that had not been opened in a year. She patted my hand and said, "Truth has feet, Lorraine, it will walk in." When the sky turned the color of ripe plums, I went inside and wrote out tomorrow in my ledger. I would bake the flan our regulars love and I would pick up more parchment and I would keep my eyes open. I walked through the rooms of my house one by one, touching the back of a chair, smoothing a curtain, counting the spoons like a woman taking inventory of what will remain when the storm passes. Before bed I stood at the bathroom mirror and told myself out loud that dignity is a choice. I chose it. I tucked the covers to my chin and listened to Julian turn over and mumble about a meeting that would run late again. The clock answered him. Said not forever. Said almost. In the morning when the sun pushed a thin blade of gold across our floor, I was ready. My voice was steady. My hands were quiet. And the woman I used to be began to make room for the woman I would need to become. If you are still here with me, I am grateful. Like and subscribe if you want to walk this road a little farther. And tell me your city in the comments because tonight we are neighbors and truth is on our street. Morning opened with the click of the bakery keys and the soft shiver of the metal gate. And I told myself to breathe like a woman walking across a narrow bridge. Cinnamon rose in the warm air and I tried to let the scent steady me. I kept hearing the clock from home even though it was not here. That patient tick living under my skin. I boxed pastries, tied ribbons, and wrote neat labels with a fine black pen. The kind that makes your hand look calmer than your heart. When the delivery driver signed for 3 dozen flans, I saw the reflection of my own face in the glass door. And it looked like a woman keeping secrets from herself. I wiped the counter and thought of the note Julian left. Busy day, love you. And I heard my own voice answer inside me with a question I did not say out loud. Love me how? The first wave of suspicion had not been a shout. It had been that sweet floral trace on his jacket collar that did not belong in my house. A fragrance I knew from department store aisles but never wore. Too sugary for a woman who lives by the truth of butter and salt. I carried that scent in my memory the way a person carries a pebble in their shoe. Not enough to stop your steps but enough to change them. After the morning rush I closed the register and brewed a small pot of coffee at the back table. I opened my ledger to update invoices. But before I wrote a single number I took out my phone and scrolled to an image I had not meant to see the night before. His screen had glowed on the sofa like a small moon and a message had floated there that did not belong to me. You were incredible tonight. A heart followed. No name. Just an initial. I sat with that picture the way you sit with a doctor who has not yet spoken. I told myself I could be wrong. My mother always warned me that hurt will write its own fiction if you do not give it facts. So I decided to gather facts. Not to make a storm. To make a record. I said a short prayer that my steps would be steady and my hands would not shake when the first truth arrived. After lunch I took a bus downtown to the hotel where Julian once loved to order a steak we could not afford and a bottle of wine he said would mark our 10th year. And I walked past it like a museum of something that might never have been real. Then I went to the Grand Hotel to check on a late payment, because business is a kind of shelter when your house feels thin. The clerk smiled and asked for my signature. And as I leaned in to sign I smelled that same floral note on the woman behind me. I looked at the brand she carried in her tote and I tucked the name away. I am a baker, but I am also a librarian of small details. On my way home I stopped for milk. and when I reached for a basket, a receipt fluttered from my pocket. Not mine. Julian must have tucked it into my coat at some point, thoughtless as a man folding a napkin and missing the trash. I smoothed it on the counter near the bananas and read the city first, because cities tell stories before menu items do. San Antonio. The date was last night. The time was after I heard him say he would be late in Dallas. 2 entrees, a steak and a creamy pasta. 1 bottle of Cabernet like the one from our 10th year. I felt the floor tilt a little and then settle. I photographed the receipt and emailed the photo to myself and to a private account I kept for recipes and contracts and dull things that keep a woman afloat. I did not shake. I did not cry. I signed for the milk and the cashier wished me a blessed day. And I said amen, because blessings do not stop just because your husband forgets how to keep a promise. When I reached home, the late sun painted the hallway in gold. I set the milk in the fridge and lifted the lid of the laundry basket to wash his shirts before they carried memories I did not want to touch. The floral note rose again like a hand on my shoulder and I stepped back, steady but certain now that a new rhythm had entered my house and it was not mine. I opened the window to let in fresh air. Then I walked to the driveway with a roll of paper towels and a small trash bag, and I told myself I was just tidying his car like I always did when he forgot. The glove compartment clicked open with that little cough it makes. And there were maps and napkins and an old pair of work gloves and a small tube that looked like nothing you could show your pastor and still call your face calm. I did not linger. I took a picture with my phone, the label half visible, enough to remember without needing to hold it any longer than a second. I put it exactly where I had found it, tucked at an angle under the owner's manual. Under the back seat there were 2 napkins with a faint print of roses and that same sugar-heavy scent. Not my rose water, not my tea, not my skin. I did not lift them. I simply looked. Then I stepped away and washed my hands at the garden tap, and watched the clear water run over my fingers like a promise that I would keep to myself. At the kitchen table I placed the images in a folder on a small portable drive I keep for recipes and audits and scanned contracts. I labeled the folder with the date, the time, the place. It is a strange comfort to see the truth written in an ordinary font. Sister Bernice called, asking about the prayer list for Sunday, and I answered like any other Thursday, because life keeps doing its job, even when your heart has left the office early. After we hung up I sat for a long time and thought about what to do next. A woman can be strong and still be wise enough to ask for help. Years ago, when another woman I knew had doubts, she told me about a private investigator she trusted who did not bring noise where quiet would do. I found his card in my recipe box, tucked behind a stained index card for sweet potato pie. The name was Thomas. I dialed and let it ring through once, twice, and on the 3rd ring he answered with a voice that sounded like gravel smoothed by rain. I told him my name and I told him I needed clarity without trouble. He said he did not make trouble. He only looked where people did not want to be seen in public, and he never crossed a line the law would regret. We met at a small cafe 2 bus stops from my street. The waitress knew me by name and brought a pot of tea without asking. I slid a manila envelope across the table and Thomas opened it and studied the photographs without looking at me like a man reading instructions he already knows by heart. He asked me for dates and times and the pattern of Julian's late nights. I told him what I knew and told him what I would not do. I would not enter any locked account. I would not follow anyone into private spaces. I would not make a mess I could not sweep. He nodded and said public places have eyes, and sometimes that is the only light you need. He said he would let me know if he saw something that changed my next step. I walked home in a wind that rattled the trees and I held myself the way you hold a pie fresh from the oven, steady hand under careful steps. The first message came that same evening, when the bakery had closed and I was counting change at the counter. A photo appeared on my phone with a timestamp from a restaurant I knew from downtown. Julian in a light blue shirt I had ironed on Sunday, the cloth smooth across his back. His head bent toward a woman with long hair and a dress that shone like a dark ribbon. The woman lifted her hand to brush something from his sleeve and I knew that hand. Alyssa. My daughter-in-law. Married to my son Darius by vow and by the quiet dinners we had shared across my kitchen table. My breath left me and returned in a single hard push. I set the phone on the counter and stood still until the sugar jar in the flour bin and the rack of cooling trays came back into focus. I picked the phone up again and zoomed in until the pixels blurred and then backed away because there are some distances you must keep even when you are staring at a screen. Another photo followed and showed them seated at a candlelit table off to the side of the main room, not so hidden that a stranger could not see them laugh, but hidden enough that they thought the world would not watch. He looked at her the way a man looks at a picture he has already decided to buy. The third image was a short clip from across the street when they stepped into the night. He opened the car door and his hand hovered at her back and she smiled as if the sidewalk knew her name. My first thought was not a scream. It was a sentence. My son will break. Then something in me went very quiet, like a lake when the boats move away. I saved the files, copied them to the drive, added places and times, wrote the restaurant name, wrote the street. I sipped water like it was medicine. I turned the lights off in the front and sat in the dark doorway between the shop and the kitchen and listened to the walk-in cooler hum. Truth has a sound when it lands. It is low and steady. It does not ask your permission. The next day Thomas sent another image, this one outside a glass and stone building near the courthouse, a place where lawyers keep rooms with quiet carpets. Julian stood at the curb with Alyssa, and the white letters on the second floor read legal services through the trees. Thomas followed with a note that said public sidewalk only, no entry, not crossing any line. He is a careful man. I thanked him. I wrote the address down on an index card. Later that afternoon he sent a small audio clip, recorded from a reasonable distance in a public lot where engines coughed and a siren far away called to someone else. He said he had to raise the volume and he warned me it might hurt to hear. It did. Alyssa used a tone I had heard only in admiration when she complimented the bakery at holidays. Now it held an edge like foil. She said she wanted a faster signature on paperwork that would move assets from one hand to another, and that she was tired of waiting. Then I heard Julian, calm, almost cheerful, saying not to worry, that I trusted him, that I would sign what he asked me to sign because I did not read all the lines anymore. My eyes burned and then cooled. I saved the clip and labeled it with date and place. I did not forward it to Darius. I did not call Julian and empty my heart against a wall that would not listen. I went to the church and sat in the last pew and told the Lord I wanted justice, but I did not want to lose myself. Sister Bernice found me there and sat beside me without asking and put her hand on my shoulder like a woman steadying another woman on a boat. She said, "You do not have to fight loud to fight well. You just have to see what you see and stand where you stand." When I left the church, the sky was the color of iron and the air smelled like rain. At home I made soup and diced carrots into small even cubes because order is a prayer too. I placed my ring in a little ceramic dish for the first time in 2 decades while I washed my hands, and when I finished I put it back on because I was not done being married yet. I would end it with the same care I used to begin it. That night when Julian said he would have a late meeting, I said, "All right, and God keep you." He kissed my cheek and the floral scent brushed my hair and I did not move. After he left I checked the doors twice and made tea and wrote a list of what I now knew. 1. A message that spoke like a lover. 2. A receipt in a city that did not match his words. 3. A tube under the seat and napkins with a scent that never belonged in my kitchen. 4. Images of my husband and my son's wife hand in hand under open lights where anyone could witness them. 5. A public conversation about papers that could steal what I built with my waking hours. I added a 6th line and left it blank, for what would come next, because truth likes to bring a friend. In the early morning Thomas texted that a balcony on the 3rd floor of a hotel near the river showed 2 figures standing too close for in-laws. He sent a still frame through a lens that kept its distance and yet saw enough, and in that frame Julian had his arm around Alyssa and her head touched his shoulder like a girl in a borrowed story. I felt a kind of quiet fury that did not spill over. It lived inside my ribs and warmed me in a way that felt like resolve. I did not ask for more photos. I had enough. Enough to know the shape of what I was carrying. Enough to protect what was mine. Enough to keep my voice level when the time came to speak. I spent that day at the bakery moving like a clock I could trust. I frosted cakes, shook powdered sugar over the flans, cleaned the glass until my hands smelled like lemon. People came and went with ordinary errands and ordinary greetings, and every hello reminded me that the world is larger than any man's lie. Around closing time a regular customer, Mrs. Peterson, asked if I planned to bring back the peach cobbler this weekend, and I heard myself say yes, and I was grateful for the sound of my own steadiness. When the lights were off and the floor was mopped, I sat at the back table and opened the folder of files once more. I clicked through images only long enough to confirm names and places, then closed each window like a woman shutting drawers in a house she is packing. I backed the drive up to a second device and sealed both in a plain envelope. I wrote the date on the outside and placed it in a drawer with family photographs. I looked at a picture of Darius on the day he pinned his badge. Pride stood straight in his shoulders. Beside that picture was a small snapshot of Alyssa at a holiday table, her smile bright, the kind of bright you want to believe. I did not tear it. I did not turn it over. I closed the drawer and put my hands flat on the wood and thanked the Lord that paper can hold what hearts cannot. When Julian came home, his voice was bright like a salesman. He said a client from out of town was considering a big project and might come by this weekend. He suggested I rest on Saturday and let him handle errands. I said that sounded fine. He looked relieved in a way that told me more than any confession. He patted my shoulder like a man checking a coat on a rack and went to wash up. I stood in the kitchen and let the quiet settle around me. I thought of my son and of the team he leads, men and women who run toward trouble for a living, and I asked that if trouble came to my street, it would come in the light where everyone could see what it was. I am not a woman who loves revenge. I am a woman who believes in correction. But when betrayal stands on your front step and knocks with a sweet scent on its hands, you do not pretend you cannot hear. You collect what is true. You place it where it can be found. You let the right people do their jobs. By the time the clock in our hallway chimed 9, I had formed a plan that did not need noise. I would speak to a lawyer soon, but first I would watch one more day to see if the lies would tangle themselves without me touching them. I slept with my jaw unclenched for the first time all week, not because pain had left, but because purpose had taken a seat at my table. In the morning I stood on the porch with my coffee and saw Sister Bernice watering her geraniums across the street. She called out to ask if I needed anything from the market. I said maybe extra sugar for the weekend. She smiled and said that truth has a sweet tooth. It likes to be baked into something you can share. I laughed and the sound surprised me, but it was real. The day stretched before me like a clean sheet of parchment. I was ready to write the next line. The next morning I woke before the alarm, my mind sharper than it had been in months. The clock said 5, and the first gray light was touching the curtains. Julian snored softly beside me. I stared at the ceiling fan turning slow circles and told myself I would not spend another day waiting for lies to tell themselves. I dressed quietly, pulling on jeans and a loose sweater, and brewed coffee so strong it could have walked out of the cup. The first plan formed while the percolator hissed. I would gather everything neatly, the same way I prepared pastry orders. Measure, record, seal. I was done being a silent witness to my own life. I took the small drive from the drawer and added a password, one I would not forget, then slipped it into my pocketbook. I left the house before the sun cleared the rooftops. The bakery smelled of sugar and courage. I started the ovens, but instead of rolling dough I opened my laptop and searched the local courthouse database. Public records are a quiet weapon. Anyone who wants to steal what you own leaves a footprint somewhere. There was nothing yet under Julian's name. No joint applications, no suspicious filings. Still, I printed the page that said no records found because sometimes absence is proof of timing. At 8 I called the number Sister Bernice had given me months ago, the lawyer from the Women's Legal Aid who had helped her niece through a hard divorce. The woman who answered introduced herself as Harper Wells. Her voice was calm, low, with that rhythm of someone who listens before speaking. I told her I was seeking advice, not battle, at least not yet. She asked me to come by the next morning, to bring any documents or evidence I had. She said, "Bring what you have and leave what you imagine at home." That line made me smile. It sounded like something a preacher would say. I agreed. The rest of the day I baked, because steady hands make steady hearts. Each time I folded dough, I imagined folding pieces of my life back into order. By evening, I had chosen the tone of my own story. Not vengeance but exposure. I would let truth walk in under the brightest light. When Julian came home, he mentioned another meeting on Saturday, and asked if I wanted him to pick up groceries while he was out. His eyes darted away when he asked, a small movement that told a long story. I said I'd handle groceries myself. I wanted him to feel comfortable enough to keep his pattern unchanged. The trap, if you can call it that, would be made of patience, not violence. The next morning I met Harper in her small downtown office. The place smelled faintly of coffee and printed paper. She took notes while I laid out receipts, photographs, and Thomas's written summary. She did not flinch when I mentioned Alyssa's name. She said calmly, "You'll need to secure your business accounts and property titles. Infidelity is a wound. Theft is a crime." She advised me to open a new account under Sweet Lorraine's LLC and to change delivery authorizations. "Do not alert him yet," she added. "Just protect the paperwork." Harper explained that if Julian and Alyssa were plotting to transfer assets, any attempt could be challenged easily once their affair became public. She reminded me that public behavior in a family-owned business community carries its own justice. I told her I wasn't looking for gossip, only sunlight. She said, "Sunlight is gossip's older sister. She cleans instead of spreads." I left her office feeling lighter, not because the burden had shrunk but because it finally had a handle. On the bus ride home, I thought about all the times I'd cleaned other people's messes. The bakery counter, the church hall after Sunday lunches, my marriage. Maybe women like me had been raised to fix everything but ourselves. That was about to change. That evening I called Thomas. "I have what I need," I told him. "You can stop now." He said he'd seen enough to confirm what I already knew, and that he would delete his copies once my lawyer confirmed receipt. He paused, then said quietly, "You handled this with more dignity than most. Be proud of that." His words stayed with me. Friday night, Julian said he would work from home Saturday morning, then meet a potential investor in the afternoon. His phrasing was so smooth it almost sounded like truth again. I smiled, offered to bake something for the meeting, and he laughed nervously. "Don't trouble yourself," he said. "It's just paperwork." He did not know I'd already protected every file that mattered. When he went to bed, I sat on the couch and planned the weekend. Step 1. I'd visit the church after service and invite a few friends for a thank you lunch at the bakery, friends who also happened to be community elders, the kind of people who believed in seeing things with their own eyes. Step 2. I'd prepare copies of everything for Harper, who promised to drop by in the afternoon under the guise of picking up dessert for a fundraiser. Step 3. I'd make sure Darius's team was on shift that weekend, because life has a way of circling its own witness list. I wasn't wishing for a scene, but if a scene came, I wanted the right eyes present. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the porch like a blessing that had not checked who it was blessing. I dressed in my bakery whites, pinned my hair back, and went to church. The sermon was on patience and revelation, how truth grows like a seed under hard soil. I felt the words land in my bones. After service, I smiled through hugs and told my friends I'd be hosting a small gratitude lunch on Sunday for their support of the bakery expansion. "Bring your spouses," I said warmly. "Even Julian will be there." I saw the flicker in a few eyes. People notice more than they admit. At home, Julian spent the afternoon polishing his shoes and humming a tune that did not belong to him. He left just before 2, saying, "Don't wait up, sweetheart." I nodded, handed him a thermos of coffee, and watched him drive away. As the car turned the corner, the silence in the house swelled until it felt like a third presence. I walked room to room, straightening not out of habit but as a final inventory. Everything I wanted to keep had already been scanned, stored, or secured. The joint papers Harper prepared lay sealed in my purse. My wedding album sat closed on the dresser, a piece of history that no longer required my daily attention. Around 5, Thomas texted me one last time. They checked into the Riverlight Hotel again. I wrote back only 2 words, "Thank you." That night I did not wait for Julian to come home. I turned off the porch light, a small rebellion after decades of leaving it on. When dawn came, I rose before him, made coffee, and pretended nothing had shifted. He stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, mumbling about a long night with the investor. I smiled gently and said, "You work so hard, Julian. The least I can do is make Sunday peaceful." He nodded, relieved. "You're the best," he said, and kissed my forehead. His lips were cool. After breakfast, I told him I'd invited friends for lunch to celebrate the bakery's anniversary. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine by me," he said, trying for casual. I could see the calculation behind his eyes. A social afternoon would keep suspicion low. He did not realize I'd already moved our life from whispers to daylight. After he left to run errands, I walked next door to Sister Bernice. She was trimming her roses. I told her everything, the photos, the lawyer, the plan. Her eyes flashed. Not with surprise but with that old strength women carry for each other. "You've been quiet long enough," she said. "Let the sun do what it does." Together we made sandwiches and sweet tea for the guests. By noon the bakery gleamed. The bell over the door rang as Mrs. Peterson arrived first, followed by 2 church deacons, my accountant, and Harper herself, carrying a box of donation forms for appearance's sake. They gathered around the big wooden table, laughter soft but expectant. The clock above the counter ticked toward 1. Julian was late. At 1:30 his car finally pulled into the alley. He walked in smiling, wearing the same light blue shirt from the photographs. My chest tightened but my face stayed serene. "You didn't tell me there'd be so many folks," he said lightly. "Surprise," I answered, keeping my tone even. "They wanted to celebrate our success." Harper nodded politely from her seat near the window. Julian looked around and spotted the folder on the counter. "What's that?" he asked. I picked it up and met his eyes. "Paperwork," I said. "Just something I've been working on." He blinked, uncertain. The bell rang again and everyone turned. It was Darius, still in partial uniform, dropping by for a quick hello before his shift. The timing felt written by a hand larger than mine. "Hey Mom," he said, kissing my cheek. "Didn't know you were throwing a party." His eyes flicked to his father, then to Harper, then back to me. I touched his arm. "Stay for a slice," I said softly. Julian shifted on his feet, glancing toward the window as if searching for an exit. I placed the folder on the table and said to the group, "Before we eat, I want to thank everyone who's supported the bakery. This place was built on faith and honesty." I paused, letting the words settle. And sometimes faith gets tested. The air in the room changed. Harper opened the folder and began distributing copies of the financial forms she had prepared. Updated ownership documents, affidavits securing the business in my name, and a notarized statement of spousal separation pending investigation of financial misconduct. Julian's smile collapsed. "What is this?" he demanded quietly. Harper answered calmly, "Mrs. Henderson has legal counsel now. You may want your own." The room was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Darius looked between us, confusion hardening into realization. "Dad?" he asked. Julian stammered. "This isn't Lorraine, you don't understand." I raised a hand. "I understand plenty. And I'd like everyone here to witness that I am protecting what's mine. Whatever comes next will happen in the open." My voice did not shake. The bakery bell jingled again, and through the front glass I saw a figure pause, a neighbor holding her phone, curious about the gathering. I waved her in with a smile. "We're celebrating honesty," I said. Laughter bubbled awkwardly, but no one left. Julian's phone buzzed on the table, and without meaning to, he glanced at it. The name on the screen, Alyssa, lit up like a confession. Darius saw it. He went still, color draining from his face. The room froze. Julian grabbed the phone, but it was too late. The silence was louder than any accusation. Harper cleared her throat and said evenly, "I think that concludes our paperwork for today." Julian muttered something about stepping outside, but the door had already become a wall of eyes. Sister Bernice stood firm by the counter, her gaze steady as stone. I turned to the room and said, "Lunch is ready. Please eat." I promised we'd celebrate. Slowly the tension thinned. People began serving themselves, murmuring polite words to fill the air. Julian slipped out the back door without another word. Darius stood there, jaw tight, then whispered, "Mom, I'm on call this afternoon. If you need anything, you call me." His voice cracked, but he did not look back as he left. When the guests departed, Harper stayed behind to help clean. "You handled that perfectly," she said quietly. "No noise. No risk. Just daylight." I smiled, though my throat burned. Daylight hurts, but it heals too. She handed me a new folder labeled Preliminary Divorce Packet and said she'd file it Monday. After she left, I locked the front door and sank into a chair. The bakery smelled of sugar and lemon polish, the scent of endurance. Outside, children played in the street, their laughter floating in through the screen door. I leaned my head back and whispered a prayer of thanks. The plan had worked, not because it destroyed but because it revealed. I had turned on every light in the house, and now the shadows had nowhere left to live. Sunday began like any other. The kind of calm morning that fools you into thinking storms have manners. The street outside Sweet Lorraine smelled of fried eggs and gardenia from the neighbor's porch. I set out folding chairs and trays of pastries for the gratitude lunch. Sunlight poured through the front glass, gold and heavy, and I whispered a prayer that when truth came walking, it would do so with grace. Julian hadn't spoken much since yesterday's confrontation at the bakery. He left before dawn, saying he needed time to think. I let him go. Silence is sometimes a bigger answer than shouting. I polished the counter, set out napkins, and arranged hydrangeas in a vase Sister Bernice had brought. Around 11, the first guests began arriving. Mrs. Peterson with her lemon pound cake, Deacon Harris with his booming laugh, and Harper Wells carrying a stack of manila folders tucked under her arm. They filled the room with the smell of church perfume and Sunday hats. I poured sweet tea and smiled as if nothing in the world was trembling. The doorbell chimed again and in came Darius, my son, in his crisp firefighter uniform. He'd stopped by on his lunch break, the badge on his chest catching the light. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said, hugging me. "What's all this?" "Just thanking folks for keeping the bakery going," I answered. He grinned, not yet seeing the tremor under my calm. By noon, laughter filled the air, the sound of spoons against porcelain, a soundtrack of small-town peace. Then the front door opened and Julian stepped in. He wore that same blue shirt again, as if pretending constancy could hide corruption. A faint floral scent followed him like a witness. For a moment no one spoke. He nodded at the guests, his smile thin. "I didn't realize you were entertaining half the congregation," he joked. "Truth likes company," I replied. He went pale. Harper caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. She moved toward the back counter where the folder from yesterday lay waiting, her cue ready. But fate did not wait for paperwork that day. It came earlier, louder, wrapped in sirens. From outside, a sudden shout. "Fire! Fire on Auburn Avenue!" People turned toward the windows as the high whine of an approaching engine cut through the warm afternoon. The bell over the door jingled frantically as neighbors rushed in from the street, faces wide with curiosity. Darius snapped to attention, instincts overtaking confusion. "Stay inside," he ordered, pulling his radio from his belt. The dispatcher's voice crackled. "Unit 7, residential alarm at 242 Auburn. Repeat, 242 Auburn." My stomach dropped. That was our home address. Julian's face drained of color. He stammered, "That can't be." Darius was already sprinting toward the door, shouting for his crew. The bakery guests followed behind, a ripple of murmurs and questions. I grabbed my purse, heart thundering. "Lord, give me strength," I whispered. Within minutes, the street filled with neighbors in robes and slippers, pointing toward the thin plume of gray smoke curling from our kitchen window 3 houses down. 2 fire engines screamed to a stop, lights flashing. Children pressed close to their parents as the crowd thickened. I stood with Sister Bernice across the street, watching Darius command his team. He was all focused now, voice crisp and steady. "Check the kitchen first. Secure the line." The crew ran into the house. Julian stood a few feet away, his hands trembling. I left the stove on," he said under his breath. I turned to him sharply. "You cooked this morning?" He hesitated. "No, I." Before he could finish, another sound rose. A shriek, high and unmistakably female, from inside the house. The crowd gasped. Darius disappeared through the doorway, shouting orders. Seconds later his voice boomed. "We've got 2 victims inside." The murmurs swelled like surf. "Who?" someone asked. "Who's in there?" Julian's knees buckled. He whispered, "Oh God." I stared at him, the truth blooming in front of everyone like fire through paper. Moments later Darius emerged carrying a heavy blanket wrapped around 2 tangled figures. Julian's mistress Alyssa and a man from the neighborhood holding her shoulders steady. The crowd parted in stunned silence. Alyssa's hair was wild, her face streaked with smoke and tears. Julian staggered forward. "Alyssa!" Gasps rippled through the onlookers. "Alyssa!" Mrs. Peterson repeated in disbelief. "Your son's wife." The world seemed to stop. Darius froze mid-step, the radio slipping from his hand. "What did you just say?" he demanded. Alyssa looked up, eyes red, lips trembling. "Darius, please." He stepped back as if struck. "You my father?" His voice cracked on the word. Julian reached for him, but Darius pulled away. The crowd's hush broke into whispers, then a low wave of outrage. Lord have mercy. That poor boy. A shame before God. I didn't move. I just stood beneath the maple tree, my purse clutched to my chest. Harper appeared beside me, her voice steady. You don't have to say a word, Lorraine. Let them speak for you. And they did. The neighborhood became a courtroom without walls. Phones rose in trembling hands. Someone started recording. Darius shouted. Get them both to the ambulance. His crew obeyed silently, wrapping Alyssa and Julian in separate blankets. Their faces turned away from each other, from everyone. The sirens began again, louder this time, swallowing every prayer, every whisper. I watched as my son knelt on the curb, his head in his hands. The sight tore through me, but the air around us carried something else too. Justice, raw and public. When the ambulance doors shut, Mrs. Peterson turned to me, tears in her eyes. Baby, you knew? I nodded once. I knew. And now everyone else does too. The firefighters doused the last smoke from the kitchen window. It hadn't been a real blaze, just a skillet left too long on an empty burner, smoke and sparks. But it had done its job. The universe has its own timing. As the engines pulled away, neighbors lingered in clusters, talking in low tones. Someone said, she caught them right in their sin. Another murmured, God don't like ugly. Sister Bernice slipped her arm around me. It's over, she whispered. The street has eyes and the truth has legs. Later that evening, after statements were given and police tape fluttered loose in the breeze, Darius came to the bakery. His face was gray with shock. I poured him coffee the same way I used to when he studied late in high school. He sat in silence for a long time, then finally said, Mom, did you set that fire? I met his eyes. No, son. The fire was already burning. I just stopped pretending I couldn't see the smoke. He covered his face and began to weep. I placed a hand on his shoulder. What they did doesn't define you, I told him. You are still your father's son, but you don't have to be his mistakes. Outside, the street lamps flickered on one by one like candles after a storm. People still gathered in small knots, talking softly. Some came to the bakery door, asking if I was all right. I told them I was fine. More than fine, I was free. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Someone's video of the fire rescue had spread online overnight. The caption reading, Father-in-law and daughter-in-law rescued from smoke incident. The comments were cruel, but also full of sympathy for me and Darius. I didn't read past the first few lines. I'd already lived the words. By noon, reporters had driven through Auburn Avenue, cameras flashing. Harper handled them with calm precision, reminding everyone that no one had been seriously hurt, that the bakery remained open, and that Mrs. Henderson has no further comment. Still, the gossip traveled faster than any press release. In the grocery store, women whispered behind shelves. In church, heads bent together in prayer mixed with shock. Yet wherever I went, someone squeezed my hand saying, We're proud of you, Lorraine. You stood tall. That night, I sat alone in the bakery with the lights dimmed. The oven ticked as it cooled. I looked around the space that had held my entire adult life. 40 years of recipes, laughter, sweat, and grace. And I felt something unclench in my chest. Julian's betrayal had not burned me down. It had only cleared the ash from my roof. When I finally went home, the house smelled faintly of smoke and lavender detergent. The kitchen window was boarded with plywood, the only visible wound. I poured a glass of water and looked around the silent room. His jacket still hung on the back of a chair, smelling of expensive cologne and failure. A knock came at the door. It was Sister Bernice holding a pot of stew. You need to eat, she said firmly. I'm not hungry, I replied. Then eat for strength, she insisted. She set the pot down, glanced around the kitchen and sighed. You did what most women only dream of doing, taking back your name. I smiled faintly. I didn't plan for it to happen this way. She shrugged. God's plans don't need your permission, baby. After she left, I stood by the window, listening to the cicadas begin their night song. Somewhere in the distance a siren wailed again, echoing down Auburn like a memory that wouldn't rest. But this time it didn't make me flinch. It sounded almost like closure. The following Sunday, church pews were full. Pastor Green changed his sermon at the last minute to speak about truth and deliverance. He didn't mention my name, but every head turned toward me when he said, "When the Lord exposes darkness, it isn't punishment. It's cleansing." I sat upright, hands folded, eyes clear. After service, the women surrounded me in the fellowship hall. "You've shown us what grace looks like under fire," Mrs. Peterson said, pressing my hand. "Literally," someone else added, and laughter rolled through the room, the first light laughter in weeks. That afternoon Darius came by the bakery with a small bag. Inside was my old photo album, rescued from the smoke. "I thought you'd want this," he said quietly. The cover was singed at the edges, but the pictures inside were mostly untouched. I flipped through them: our wedding, his first day of school, Julian at the bakery counter holding a tray of bread. I stopped on that image, the smile of a man who once promised forever, and whispered, "You had your chance." Then I closed the album and set it behind the counter, next to the cash register where it could remind me, without haunting me. By evening the street returned to normal. Children rode bikes again. The scent of barbecue drifted from a neighbor's yard. Life had moved forward, even if my heart still walked slowly behind it. At sunset I took out my ledger and wrote 3 lines under tomorrow's date. Bake fresh peach cobbler for Mrs. Peterson. Call Harper to finalize documents. Begin again. I drew a small checkmark beside each line and closed the book. Outside, the last streak of orange faded into blue, and the bakery sign glowed softly. Sweet Lorraine's Truth Baked Daily. I smiled, not because revenge was sweet, but because justice had finally learned my name. The hospital hallway smelled like bleach and the end of long stories. Fluorescent lights hummed and the floor shone like a warning. I walked with steady steps, my purse tucked under my arm, the folder from Harper pressing against my ribs. Darius led the way, his boots quiet on the linoleum, his back straight from a lifetime of running into smoke. He did not look left or right. He had the posture of a man who has decided to survive. A nurse with kind eyes asked if I was family. I said yes and felt the weight of that word. Family is a house that sometimes burns from the kitchen out. She guided us to a small consultation room with 2 chairs and a table that held a box of tissues as if the room had a script. Darius stood rather than sit. He rubbed his hands together and stared at the blank wall. I placed my purse on the table and waited for our names to be called. When the door opened, Julian walked in with a hospital blanket over his shoulders like a borrowed dignity. He looked smaller than yesterday, like a shirt washed too many times. Alyssa sat in a wheelchair behind him, her eyes red, her voice gone small. 2 security officers hovered in the doorway, indifferent and polite. Harper arrived a minute later, her heels soft against the floor, a stack of documents in her hands. She nodded to me, then to Darius, then addressed the room as if she were in her own office with a view of the law. "Mrs. Henderson has prepared statements and a separation agreement. We will speak plainly," she said. I turned to Julian. "You told me you needed time to think. Now we will give that time a purpose." He started a speech I knew by heart. "Lorraine, it was a mistake. It was confusion. It was loneliness." The words fell like dull pennies. I raised my hand and he stopped. The room did not need his old lines. Darius stood between us, not as a barrier but as a witness. He looked at his father and something broke in his face and then settled. "Dad," he said. The word so soft it almost did not belong in the room. "Did you think about me at all?" Julian tried to reach for his son but Darius did not move. "You taught me to hold a line," Darius said. "I hold a line for strangers every day. I will hold one for my mother now." Harper placed the first document on the table. It secured Sweet Lorraine's in my sole control. The second established a formal separation and moved our house into a protective trust pending divorce. The third was a request for discovery regarding any accounts where my name had been used or proposed to be used without consent. Julian glanced at Alyssa as if she could save a bridge already in the river. She stared at her hands. I could feel anger rise in my chest like heat, but I kept my voice cool. "You thought I would sign whatever you put in front of me because I am a tired woman who trusts the man she married. You misread me. I am the woman who reads every line and counts every spoon." He looked stunned that I was not shouting. He has always confused quiet with weakness. Harper slid a pen across the table. Julian stared at it like it was a map back to a country he had lost. He tried to bluff. Lorraine, can we talk alone? We owe each other that. I shook my head. We owe the truth an audience. I have given you half my life in private. This part will be handled in daylight. The nurse peeked in to check on the room, then left quickly. The hallway voices moved like a soft river outside our door. Alyssa whispered to Darius, I am sorry. I made a terrible choice. Her voice shook. He did not look at her. A terrible choice is a wrong turn on Peachtree when you are late for church, he said. What you did is not a choice. It is a decision that removes ground from under other people. She began to cry, not the loud kind that asks for a rescue, but the heavy kind that recognizes there will be none. Harper spoke again. Mr. Henderson, sign these temporary orders. You will vacate the marital home today. You will not access business accounts. You will provide a list of all debts and liabilities within 7 days. She placed a separate envelope on the table. In here is a preliminary notice to Alyssa regarding a potential civil action for attempted fraud if evidence confirms the scheme we have reason to believe was in motion. Alyssa looked at me with a face I used to hand sweet potato pie. I felt a thin thread of pity. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But pity is a kind of kindness you give yourself so you do not turn into what hurt you. Julian still would not pick up the pen. He began to talk about love and history and the cost of lawyers. Harper let him speak for exactly 30 seconds, and then interrupted without raising her voice. Sir, refusal today will lead to a judge tomorrow. You have little leverage and no privacy left. Choose the easier road. He blinked. He signed. The sound of the pen on paper was small and decisive. The room exhaled. Alyssa signed the acknowledgement in her envelope with a trembling hand as if the ink weighed more than her wrist. Darius watched without a word. When it was done, Harper gathered the pages and tapped them into a neat stack like a woman closing a chapter. She told Julian where to pick up a copy later, and which items he could collect from the house for the next 2 weeks. Essentials only. No documents. No art. No rings. She stood. We are finished here. Thank you for your cooperation. A security officer stepped forward and asked Julian if he needed a ride to the lobby. He shook his head. Pride is the last thing that leaves a man, and sometimes it is the last thing that should. He walked to the door, then turned back to me as if to say a line that had saved him before. I spared us both. Go on, I said. We are already late for the rest of our lives. The door closed and the hallway swallowed him. Alyssa remained in the chair, silent. She reached for me and then stopped herself. I am not your judge, I said. That job is taken. I am only the woman who will not clean up after what you chose. Darius wheeled her to the nurse's station and told the staff she would be discharged once cleared. He thanked them with a voice that had learned command and sorrow in the same day. We left the hospital into bright afternoon sun. The city looked exactly the same and completely different. The sky had no idea it had watched a family end. At the bakery, Sister Bernice had set a kettle on and placed 2 cups by the window where the geraniums caught the light. She kissed my cheek and squeezed Darius' hand. You both stood up, she said. That is what matters. We sat, the 3 of us, and drank tea that tasted like a pause. I told Darius the practical steps. Locks would be changed by evening. The bank would confirm new controls by morning. The church deacons would help move any furniture we needed to store. He nodded, absorbing each item like instructions for a scene he would manage at a fire. When we finished, he asked for the folder. I gave it to him and he read every page, lips moving slightly on the legal lines. He closed it and said, Mom, you did not just save the bakery. You saved our name. Night fell and the street softened into porch lights and quiet talk. Some neighbors looked toward our windows and then away, respectful and curious. Life in a black neighborhood is a chorus that knows when to sing and when to hum. Mrs. Peterson arrived with a casserole, and a look that said I told you it would be all right, even though she had never said that before. We ate a little at the counter. We washed dishes in silence. After she left, I stood by the door and listened to the old clock. It sounded different. Not louder. Truer. The next days moved with the useful rhythm of paperwork and cleaning. Harper filed the initial petition. The bank manager shook my hand and said the community was with me. The insurance adjuster came to document the small kitchen damage at home, and shook his head at the gossip he had heard. He said focus on what can be fixed and leave the rest to time. I liked that. I put it in my pocket like a spare key. People asked me if I would ever forgive. I said that forgiveness is a gate I might walk through one day for my own sake, but I would not throw it open before the fence was mended. At church a week later, Pastor Green preached about the difference between revenge and restoration. He did not call me by name, but he smiled at me in a way that tucked strength back under my ribs. Alyssa sent a letter through Harper. It was careful and formal. She said she would not contest the divorce from Darius and would agree to reasonable terms so he could live in peace. She said she would seek counseling. I read it twice, then set it in a drawer with other papers that had changed my life. Darius stopped by most evenings after his shift. Sometimes we cooked. Sometimes we sat on the stoop and watched children chalk flowers on the sidewalk. He asked me once if he should confront his father again. I said no. You confronted him by standing. Not all fights need more rounds. Let the quiet finish what the noise began. A month passed. Julian moved into a small apartment across town. He called twice. I did not pick up. He texted once. I deleted it without reading. The past can be a thief who learns to pick locks if you keep leaving doors cracked open. I had nothing left to say that would make any new floor under our feet. One afternoon, I was frosting a lemon cake when a delivery came with no return address. Inside was the bottle of Cabernet from our 10th anniversary, the same vintage, the same label, the same idea of a love too big to afford. I stood for a long time, holding the neck of the bottle like a memory I had finally learned to put down. I took it to the back and set it on a shelf. Not as a keepsake. As an exhibit. Here is the story we told. Here is the truth we lived. I created a bulletin board near the register called Community Strength. I pinned up photos of customers smiling with their pies. I posted notices for church coat drives and free health screenings. I added a card that said Women Rebuild Fund and a jar for small donations to help women in the neighborhood hire legal help when they needed it. The jar filled faster than I expected. People wanted to put their hands on something that looked like an answer. On the day the preliminary hearing was scheduled, I wore my best navy dress and black flats that do not lie about a woman's age. Harper met me on the courthouse steps. She had a hand on my elbow and a sentence ready. We will take the high road even if we have to build it as we walk. She meant it figuratively, but I could almost see the gravel under our feet. Inside, the judge was brisk and practical. He confirmed the temporary orders, granted exclusive control of the business to me, and set a date for the division of property. Julian sat at the other table with a lawyer I did not know. He looked at me only once, and even then he glanced away as if daylight hurt. When the gavel fell, I felt no triumph. I felt closure begin, like a door that finally learned how to find its frame. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting again. Harper told them in a firm voice that the bakery was open and strong, and that the family requested privacy. I added one sentence for the camera because sometimes the microphone is a neighbor too. I said, to anyone carrying a heavy truth, you do not need to start a fire to be heard. Stand still in the light and let the right people do their jobs. Then I went home and took a nap that tasted like a clean sheet. Consequences continued to ripple out. Alyssa moved in with an aunt on the other side of town. Darius filed his own papers and set up counseling through the department. He began to laugh again, a small sound at first, then fuller, like a room remembering its windows. I hired 2 young women from the church to help at the bakery after school. I taught them how to level a cake and how to level your voice. Both skills carry you through rooms where people decide your worth. One evening, the block threw an outdoor potluck. Children chased each other with glow sticks. Men argued about baseball. Women compared pound cakes and laughed with the kind of laughter that reminds a body it is home. Someone put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Miss Lorraine, you have given a whole street permission to tell the truth." I smiled and told her the street had always known how to talk. It just needed someone to open the window. Later that night, I walked through my house, touching the backs of chairs the way I had on the first night after suspicion took root. The chairs were still chairs. The walls were still walls. The clock ticked like a metronome that had waited for me to find the beat again. I stood at the kitchen sink and washed 1 plate, 1 cup, 1 fork. I looked at my ring in the soft overhead light. I took it off and set it in the small dish where I keep loose buttons. I whispered thank you for the years that were true. I whispered goodbye to the years that were not. People ask what revenge tastes like. I tell them I would not know. What I tasted was consequence. It was plain and strong and necessary. It did not sweeten anything. It did not need to. The sweetness was in the mornings I woke without fear of who would be standing in my kitchen with my name in their mouth. The sweetness was in the bell above the bakery door, and the way it sang when Darius walked in grinning after a long shift. The sweetness was in Sister Bernice humming old gospel while she watered her geraniums and waved at me through the open window. On the anniversary of that Sunday, I hosted a gratitude day at Sweet Lorraine's. We offered small slices of pie and strong coffee. I stood by the register and greeted everyone. A woman I did not know came in shy and left braver. She pressed a note into my palm that said, "You made me remember that I am not broken." I put the note in the jar with the others and promised to keep baking. After closing, I took the old bottle of Cabernet from the shelf and gave it to Harper as a thank you. She raised an eyebrow. I said it belongs in a place where people do not confuse label with contents. We laughed. Then I locked up, turned off the lights, and walked home under a sky that had finally learned how to look like evening instead of aftermath. The aftermath was behind me. The evening was mine. The week after court felt like walking through water in a dress that used to fit. I moved, I worked, I smiled when people needed me to, and yet everything felt heavy in the places no one could see. Morning light came even when I did not ask for it. I would wake to the sound of the wall clock and for a moment forget what the sound had carried across my days. Then the memory would arrive on schedule, and I would lie there pretending I was only listening to time and not to grief. In that first quiet stretch I cleaned more than I needed to clean. I took all the jars down from the kitchen shelf and washed them until the glass shone like new prayer. I wiped the baseboards with a damp cloth and marveled at how much dust a life gathers while you are busy holding it together. I gave away a box of sweaters to the church clothing drive. I kept one blush scarf I never wore and tied it around the pot of rosemary on the sill. A small flourish for a woman determined to claim softness without permission. People knocked at the bakery door earlier than usual, not to buy but to bless. They brought almonds and cards and stories of their own middle-of-the-night courage. I kept each story like a seed, small and alive, waiting to be planted in a line of earth I could trust. Some moments were not brave. Some moments were a sink full of plates because I could not carry even one more thought. In those moments I ran water and let the heat rise like a private fog and told myself to wash only what was here and now. Cup, saucer, spoon, finished. Then the next. It is remarkable what a woman can rebuild with a sponge, a list, and a little mercy. Darius came by often, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in a hoodie that still made him look 15. We said very little the first few visits. He fixed the loose screw on the back door and replaced the filter in the air vent and checked the batteries in the smoke detector, as if tending the house could settle the ache in our chests. One night he arrived with a paper bag of groceries and a sheepish smile. "Cook with me," he said. "You always let me stir but never let me chop." I handed him a knife and an onion and watched him try not to cry. When his eyes finally ran he laughed, the sound thin but true. We ate at the small table by the window and spoke about the games we had watched when he was a boy, and how he used to fall asleep with a fire truck in his hand. Before he left he touched the old clock and said, "I used to hate this sound when I studied late, but now it reminds me that nothing stays stuck." He hugged me tighter than usual and I stood in the doorway long after his taillights turned the corner. On a Monday afternoon I walked into the community center for a meeting with a counselor the church recommended. The room was plain and clean and smelled faintly of lemons, which felt like a kind invitation for a woman learning to enter new rooms alone. The counselor was a black woman near my age with hair the color of soft ash and eyes that told me she could sit with silence without rushing it. She asked me to tell her what had happened, not for the papers but for the person. I gave her the outline without the thorns and then after a pause I handed her a few thorns too. She nodded slowly and said, "You are grieving a husband and a story and an idea of yourself that was welded to both. It will come off your skin as you walk. There will be marks. That does not mean you are ruined." We met once a week. I learned small tools that did not glitter but worked. When a wave of anger rose I put both feet on the floor and named 5 things I could see. 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, 1 I could taste. When shame tried to borrow my voice I answered out loud in my empty kitchen, "I am not the deed done against me. I am the woman who lived and chose." When nostalgia tried to dress an old hurt in lace I opened the cabinet where I had placed the bottle from our 10th year, and I looked at it until the label lost its perfume and became ink and paper. Sometimes I miss Julian in the way you miss a song you sang before you learned the lyrics were unkind. I told that truth to God and to no one else. He answered by sending people to my door with fresh coffee and small laughter, and the days rolled forward like dough that knows it will rise given time and warm hands. The bakery found its rhythm again. We added a Wednesday afternoon discount for seniors, and the line wrapped past the window by 3. I hired a second oven attendant and taught her the patience of low heat and the courage of saying not yet when a customer begged for a cake to be rushed. I watched young girls count change at the register and saw future business owners standing on the tiles of my little shop. The Women Rebuild Fund jar blossomed into a full account after a local radio host interviewed me about practical rebuilding. I kept the conversation gentle. I said betrayal is a thief but you can change the locks. I said document what you know, speak when you are steady. Accept help without apology. I saw heads nodding in cars at red lights and knew how many lives ride inside the quiet of an intersection. One evening Sister Bernice and I walked the block slowly, our hands linked like teenagers who had learned to look both ways. She asked what I feared most now that the crisis had settled into consequence. I said I feared becoming hard. She laughed and said you bake for a living, baby. You do not have it in you to harden past usefulness. Give yourself the dignity of staying soft where it counts and firm where it matters. On the way back she pointed at the church steeple and said the bell does not ring because it hates silence. It rings to name a moment. You have named yours. Let the quiet stay quiet until the next naming. Her words followed me home and took off their shoes at my door. At night I slept better. Not perfect. Better. When I woke before dawn I would sit at the table with tea and write in a small notebook 3 lines only. One thing I had survived. One thing I had learned. One thing I had loved. Some mornings the lines were large. I survived the courthouse. I learned that paper can hold heat and not burn. I loved the way Darius laughed at his own bad jokes. Some mornings the lines were small. I survived a memory before breakfast. I learned I prefer cinnamon to nutmeg and oatmeal. I loved the glow on the mixing bowl when the sun hit it. The small lines stacked into a bridge I could walk across on the days grief tried to pull me into water again. The divorce papers moved like slow mail through official hands. Harper called with updates and used words like pending and filed and effective. I said thank you and then went back to measuring sugar. On the day the final decree arrived I did not cry. I made a chocolate sheet cake and cut tidy squares and set them on a platter labeled for staff only and ate one standing up by the back door where the air tasted like rain. I whispered thank you for the years that were true again, and felt the room return the words with a soft echo that sounded like a well taking a bucket. Darius came by that night with takeout and a deck of cards. He asked if I wanted to learn spades for real instead of cheating with smiles. We played until the food grew cold and we let it, and when he won he bowed like a boy. He asked what I wanted to do next, not about dinner but about life. I said I wanted to repaint the kitchen and redo the menu and take a day trip to the coast to smell salt and stand in wind that had not passed through my house first. He grinned and said we can do all of that, Mom. We began with paint. I chose a color named morning wheat that made the room look taller. We took everything off the walls and scrubbed them and rolled the new shade across old years. I kept one photograph on the fridge, a picture of my mother holding me in front of a house that no longer exists, both of us squinting into Georgia sun as if into a future we could not see but believed in anyway. I started walking in the park 3 mornings a week. Older men in baseball caps tipped their brims and women with silver braids matched my pace and asked about the bakery, and then talked about their own children without asking about mine. It was a gift to listen. I watched a grandmother teach her granddaughter how to keep rhythm with a jump rope, and realized that keeping rhythm is most of what life asks, even in the middle of change. I joined a cooking circle at the community center, a room full of women who have seen most weather and still bring dessert. We swapped recipes and repairs of the heart. I shared a version of my flan with less sugar and more patience, and watched it tremble in the center like a voice learning how to sing again. We clapped when it set. We always clap when something sets that could have fallen apart. The first time Julian crossed my path in the grocery store, he stopped at the end of the aisle and lifted a hand as if to greet. I nodded once and kept moving. My chest did not close. I drove home with soft jazz on the radio and laughed out loud when the announcer made a corny joke about peaches. The world had not ended. It had rearranged itself. That is a different kind of mercy than the one you pray for, but it is mercy still. I found a new ritual at sunset. I would open the front window and let the hush of evening slide across the floor, and I would whisper one line to the woman in the glass. You did not burn down. You learned how to carry water. Some nights Darius called from the station to say they had a quiet shift and he had cooked for the crew and the cornbread had not fallen. Pride in your child is a door that never squeaks. Toward the end of that season, the bakery hosted a small showcase for local women who run businesses from their porches and kitchens. We cleared the tables and set up booths and drank coffee strong enough to stand on. A seamstress showed aprons made from rescued fabric and told us how she forgot she could dream until her daughter reminded her. A gardener sold jars of spice blends and said she started mixing them during chemo to make food taste like hope. I stood by a sign that read Sweet Lorraine's Truth Baked Daily, and I meant every letter. When the evening ended, a woman about my age stayed behind to help stack chairs. She looked at the jar for the fund and then at me and said, I left a man who kept me small 10 years ago and I thought I left too late. Tonight I realized I left on time. We hugged the way strangers can when they have lived some of the same weather. On the drive home, the moon rode low and patient above the trees. I parked, listened to the engine click as it cooled, and went inside my house. The rosemary on the sill had outgrown its pot. I untied the blush scarf and rewrapped it around the larger clay planter I had bought that afternoon. I pressed new soil around the roots. The plant settled, green and sure. I washed my hands and looked at the clean sink and the quiet counter and the clock with its honest beat, and I could feel something inside me catch and then release. A loosening is a holy thing. I turned off the light and went to bed. I slept without waking. In the morning I would bake and walk and call my son and answer emails and pay invoices and maybe buy more lemons. It did not feel like a small life. It felt like a full one, balanced on the simple truth that a woman who refuses to lie to herself is free. Spring came early that year, the kind of gentle season that sneaks up on you after a hard winter. I woke one morning to birds at the window and realized the sound didn't hurt anymore. The house smelled of lemon oil and rising dough, and the clock ticked like an old friend who knew every secret and stayed anyway. The sunlight spilled across the floorboards in long warm ribbons, and I thought, this is what beginning again feels like. Not fireworks, just steady light finding the cracks. The bakery had never been busier. Customers came not only for pies but for peace. They lingered longer, shared stories about their own storms, left notes tucked beside napkin dispensers that said things like, you helped me leave. You reminded me I can heal. And truth wins. I pinned those notes on the corkboard next to the register, and every morning before opening I read a few, like scripture written in everyday hands. Darius stopped by most Sundays now. Sometimes he brought his new partner, a kind woman named Renee who worked as a school counselor. They didn't rush things and I liked that about them. One evening after supper he said, you know, Mom, I didn't think I'd ever laugh in this kitchen again. I smiled. You're laughing now. He nodded and said softly, that's because you kept it standing. After he left, I walked through the bakery and turned off the lights one by one. I stood by the window watching the street lamp flicker on. My reflection looked older, yes, but peaceful, like a woman who had finally finished building her own name. I whispered to that reflection, you did not just survive. You started over. The next morning I hosted a community brunch for women rebuilding after loss. It wasn't just for widows or divorcees. It was for anyone who had been left behind by life and decided to keep walking. The church choir director brought homemade biscuits. The florist donated bouquets. We filled the tables with color and coffee and laughter. When it was my turn to speak, I told them something I had learned in the quietest hours. Sometimes the Lord doesn't calm the storm because he knows you'll find your sea legs if he lets the waves roll a little longer. The room went still, then someone clapped, and then we all did. Later that afternoon I drove to the coast, a small beach 2 hours south where the air smells of salt and forgiveness. The water stretched wide and blue, steady as breath. I stood barefoot where the waves met the sand and let the cold sting my ankles awake. I thought of the years I spent shrinking myself to fit the picture of someone else's piece. I thought of the nights when betrayal sat at my table like an unwanted guest and I still served supper. I thought of how the fire, the courtroom, the gossip, all of it, had burned away what was false and left what could grow. I said out loud to the wind, thank you for leaving me standing. A seagull landed near my feet and stayed, bold as grace. When I returned to Atlanta, I began a new tradition. Every month Sweet Lorraine's would host an open mic night called Testify Tuesdays. It wasn't fancy. Just a microphone, a stool, and the smell of cobbler cooling on the counter. People came to read poems, sing hymns, tell truths they'd been too afraid to speak in their own kitchens. One woman confessed that she'd been living with her sister after leaving a cruel husband, and that hearing my story gave her courage. Another said she had forgiven a friend after 20 years. We cried, we laughed, we ate peach pie. The news spread fast, and soon even the local paper wrote an article. A bakery becomes a sanctuary on Auburn Avenue. I framed that clipping and hung it beside the door. Not for pride, but as proof that light grows where it's given a place to rest. One Thursday evening just before closing, the doorbell jingled softly. I turned and froze for a second. It was Julian. He looked older, slower, the confident edge gone from his shoulders. He took off his hat and held it in his hands like a student waiting for permission to speak. I did not invite him in, but I didn't turn him away either. He said quietly, "I heard about the fund. I'm proud of what you've built." I nodded once. It took a village and a little pain. He smiled weakly. "I came to say sorry, Lorraine. For the lies, for Alyssa, for not seeing you." I looked at him for a long moment. "I believe you're sorry. But apology and restoration aren't the same thing. I wish you peace, Julian. Just not in my house." He lowered his head, then nodded. "You always were stronger than I deserved." "No," I said gently. "I just finally remembered who I was before the forgetting started." He left quietly. The bell above the door gave a single note and fell still. I stood there for a while, not angry, not sad, just still. Forgiveness had already come. It just didn't need an audience. That night I closed the bakery early and walked home under the streetlights. The city hummed around me, full of life and rhythm. When I reached my porch, I sat on the swing and watched the moon rise over the church steeple. Sister Bernice waved from across the street, her silhouette framed by the glow of her lamp. "You look free, baby," she called out. "I feel it," I said, and it was the truth. Weeks passed. The Women Rebuild Fund grew large enough to sponsor workshops, financial literacy, self-defense, small business mentoring. Harper volunteered to teach legal basics, Darius offered fire safety lessons, and Renee helped organize mental health support. I baked for every session, making sure there was always something sweet to go with the hard conversations. During one meeting, a young woman named Candace shared that she'd left an abusive partner and used the fund to cover the first month's rent on her new apartment. She said, "I didn't think I could do it. Then I heard your story on the radio, Miss Lorraine. I figured if you could rebuild at 66, I could start at 34. The room erupted in applause, and I laughed so hard my eyes watered. That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind to wipe down tables. The air smelled of cinnamon and courage. I thought about all the hands that had worked, prayed, cried, and clapped in this room. I whispered to the empty space, "This is what rebirth looks like. Flour on your apron and hope in your lungs." In early summer, Harper invited me to speak at a city conference about women entrepreneurs. I nearly said no, but she smiled and said, "You already tell stories every day over your counter. Just bring that." So I did. I wore a soft blue dress and spoke about truth, dignity, and second chances. I said, "We spend too much time teaching women how to endure. Let's start teaching them how to begin again." The crowd stood and clapped, and I felt something inside me stretch and shine. Afterward, a woman from the mayor's office approached me about partnering on a mentorship program for young bakers. I said yes before fear could find me. That night I walked home under a sky freckled with stars and thought of the girl I used to be. The one who believed loyalty meant silence. I wanted to tell her, "You can love deeply and still leave when the love stops loving you back." Now, every morning at Sweet Lorraine's, I open the door and let the scent of warm bread spill into the street. The same clock ticks above the counter, but now its rhythm sounds like heartbeat, not countdown. The sign outside gleams in the sun. Truth baked daily. Sometimes I still think of Julian, but not with bitterness. Just memory. Sometimes I pray for Alyssa too. I pray she finds a way to face herself without running. I even pray for the version of me that stayed too long. She deserved better, and now she has it. On the first anniversary of the fire, we held a block celebration. Live jazz, kids playing double dutch, elders dancing on the sidewalk. Darius surprised me with a new bakery sign painted in gold script. Sweet Lorraine's, where truth and love rise together. When I saw it, I laughed until tears came. He wrapped me in a hug and whispered, "You taught us all how to rise, Mama." When the sun began to set, I stepped back inside for a moment of quiet. The bakery glowed amber from the inside out. I could hear music and laughter from the street, and the sound folded into me like peace. I thought about how far I had come, from suspicion, betrayal, and smoke to this. A room full of light, a heart no longer afraid of silence. I picked up my apron, brushed a bit of flour from it, and whispered to no one and everyone at once, "Truth wins." Then I turned the sign on the door from closed to open, because rebirth isn't a finish line. It's an invitation.